Welcome to Off the Grid, a podcast for small business owners who want to leave social media without losing all their clients.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go off the grid. Okay. I know that you really want to put your phone away. Yeah. Let's go off the grid.
Hello and welcome to Off the Grid, a podcast about running a wildly, softly, wonderfully successful online business without relying on social media. I'm your host, Amelia Ruby, and here on this show, I share stories, strategies, and experiments for sharing your work with radical generosity and energetic sovereignty. We are nearing the end of season 6 of the podcast. We passed 100 episodes this season. We've grown to almost 200,000 downloads this season. It has been such a joy to share so many conversations with you and a few rare solo episodes. And while I'm looking forward to my summer break, I must admit I love taking August off the podcast. I'm also already busy prepping for season 7, which is going to be all about my upcoming book. It's called Your Attention is Sacred, Except on Social Media, and it'll be out this fall. I cannot wait to put it in your hands. I'm going to do a limited edition release that'll include the first edition of the book, some extra special goodies, and a few virtual events. And my intention is that this first edition launch will really be for all of you. And then I want to use some of the funds from that launch to do a little crowdfunded book tour. So if you live somewhere across North America and you would like me to come to your city on a Your Attention is Sacred book tour, please shoot me an email. Let me know where you are. Let me know if there are venues or spaces that would be great for a book event. I would love to bring the book there. So if you'd like to see me in your city next year, 1, please keep an eye out for when the book goes on sale so you can buy a first edition copy and help me fund that book tour. And 2, send me an email if you'd like me to come to a city near you. Now, let's talk about this episode, shall we? So today on the podcast, I am doing something that I have never done before, and it wasn't even my idea. So earlier this spring, I got an email from the wonderful Melissa Wong, and she reached out to say that she was at this sort of choice point, this challenging moment in her business where she was trying to figure out if she should leave social media, and if she did, exactly how she would find new clients and bring people into her course, which of course is what we talk about here at Off the Grid, right? How to leave social media without losing all your clients, perhaps while selling your course in the process. And she wanted to know if I might be interested in having her on the podcast to talk through this decision, because she intuited that other listeners might be in a similar place. And I think a lot of listeners are in that place, and I have talked about it just about every way I know how. So I thought that having Melissa be a part of a conversation around this could really just bring up new insights, new experiences. And also, she's active on social media right now. I haven't been on social media in over 4 years. So circling back with her in this way was a really interesting experience. Now, Melissa is a coach. And so as this conversation unfolds, she starts asking me a lot of questions. You'll notice it starts with me asking Melissa questions. And then the whole middle half is Melissa asking me questions. And then we circle back to her decision making at the end. So let me tell you a bit more about Melissa, and then we'll dive in. Melissa Wong is a coach who helps creative independents design custom work they love. At Coherent Studio, she offers one-on-one coaching, group programs, and podcast conversations, all designed to help multi-talented creatives identify their unique worth and get into a place of intentional action. Prior to her work as a coach, she founded New Women's Space, which is actually where we initially met, a venue that housed over 700 gatherings by artists, healers, organizers, and small business owners. She also started Hustle Fest, a summit for professionals looking to go freelance full-time, and helped creators at Kickstarter and SoundCloud launch. Melissa has literally produced a circus, and she currently lives in Portland, Oregon with her partner, 2-year-old, and 110-pound chocolate lab. In this episode, you're going to hear me share the question she posed to me in her email, and then we will unpack what she might do with her marketing and whether she's going to stay on social media or not. I am so thrilled that you're here, dear listener, and really excited to share this conversation with you. Let's dive in. Hi, Melissa. Welcome to Off the Grid.
Thank you, Amelia. Happy to be here.
Today, we're doing something quite different. I have never done this on the podcast before. I've been calling it like a live coaching session, although live is a bit of a misnomer. Like you and I are live, but the listener is listening to a recording, obviously. In a moment, I'm going to read the question that you initially sent me so that we can start to dive in. But I'm so curious, and I bet listeners are curious too, like, what led you to even reach out? Like, why did you land in my inbox with this question?
Oh boy, yeah. I'm so excited to hear you say like, I haven't done this, or like, I'm always down to try an experiment and try something new. And, I realized that I'm coming at this probably from a slightly different angle than a lot of your listeners. So I'm really glad that you kind of saw that as like ooh, this is a little different. What if we did this?
When I think about what success looks like for Off the Grid and for my business, like, I never want the show to be so big that I don't feel excited by experiments like this. I never want the show to be so quote unquote successful that I can't even read emails from listeners because I'm so overwhelmed by it. And that was a really powerful unlock for me because there are definitely these clear paths of podcast success that are all about having, tens or hundreds of thousands of listeners and millions of downloads and big name sponsors. And when you're operating in that way, you can't read your emails from listeners. You can't be too plugged in with what any one person may be proposing or asking you. And there was something about your email that just reminded me that I love the size that Off the Grid is. And while I do want to grow the show and the community around it, I don't want to grow it so much that things like this don't feel possible anymore.
I commend you for that. I think like that recognition is a very values driven of like, what is the heart of this? How do I define success? And how can you have space to entertain a sort of listener question while also thinking of like, oh, who's a cool stretch guest that I'd love to have on this, and both can exist, but it's like finding that right special mix that sits well with you.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, I'm sure listeners want to know what you sent me, what your question was. So let me give the people what they want. Listeners, I'm going to read to you a lightly edited version of what Melissa sort of posed to me as a question we might unpack together on the show, and then we will unpack it together today. So here are Melissa's words. I am a coach for creatives who want to create custom work through self-employment, business ownership, or hybrid work. I have been running my business Coherence Studio for 5 years now and love the work that I do. I became a mom 2 years ago, and it coincided with me getting a surge of new ambition and motivation to take my business to the next level, which might not have been the most ideal timing. Recently, I've been trying to sell a few products in order to diversify my revenue streams and free up space for me and my schedule. As someone who's been pretty inactive on Instagram, I am a few months into trying to actually put more effort there and post my podcast on YouTube and even LinkedIn. The other night, my partner said to me, "This whole social media thing does not feel like you." I know it doesn't, but I also don't know how to get more people listening to my podcast or buying a product without these go-to channels. Do you have any advice for how to navigate this choice point of whether to keep pushing or to return to an old, probably healthier way of living off social media?
Well read.
Such a rich question. I'm curious if there's any more like context or touch points you want to add in before we start digging into it.
I would say like the quick chain of events that led to me being at this current moment of doing paid ads and having finally, after many moments and chapters of being like, oh, I should have a schedule that I'm posting. I should show up more regularly. I never did until the past couple months, and I've really got a rhythm with it. I would say the chain of events is I became a mom. I realized that I already felt time scarcity just as a person. I think when I think of like which monkeys are on my back, it's always like there's not enough of it, for better, for worse. I'm just aware of that monkey. And so then becoming a parent and realizing I had less time for my work than before, And if I was thinking about, my husband and I were talking about expanding our family, it was like, okay, well, there's only going to be less time. So I'm feeling the crunch of the time scarcity in a very day-to-day way. And then I think it took some pause and reflection to be like, oh, I also might be feeling the time scarcity of my life right now, of like, I'm stepping into this parent role. I'm not the youngest generation. I'm not the kid anymore. And I think like I'm about to turn 38 in a couple of weeks. So it should have dawned on me, way before this. But there is, I think, something about caring for another little one that just really accentuates the like, you're the adult here. And all to say, as I felt the what am I building question, as someone who my main gifts, I'd say, and what I've built my whole business around is very ephemeral feeling. It is conversational, it's relational, and unless I'm recording it, you just don't have an artifact for it. And I think I've been feeling the tug to create a course, like the podcast serves this purpose, but something that I can kind of look back and be like, I built that thing, right? Because of course those relationships are there and my like logical brain knows that, but there's some sort of like scared ego side of things too that is just like, am I going to get like past a prime and like to my old age and eventually deathbed and like not know what to point to? And so then I kind of realized, well, maybe it is time to try out more digital products. Like, I do tons of workshops, record them. That's already value you're sort of capturing there and being able to share with other people. But then it felt like my business model had to shift right at the introduction of products, this expectation that, then you're kind of going for a different scale. And so for me as a coach, if I'm truly doing one-on-one coaching, I don't need more than 25 clients. But if I'm selling a product, suddenly the association became, I need to have hundreds of customers. And so therefore my marketing really needs to shift. And so that's the long version of like how I arrived at like, wait, why am I paying for ads right now?
The first thing I want to say is that I really feel like what's coming through in the existential side of your question is a desire for legacy and legacy building. And I think that legacy building is a really beautiful part of having and growing a business. And it's so interesting because in the traditional way of building businesses, legacy is a big part of it, right? Especially family businesses or even just like single entrepreneur businesses. A lot of that is about ownership and it's about accruing value that can then be sold or passed on to other people. And so there's that model of legacy building in business, which is one thing. And then what I'm hearing from you is a slightly different approach to legacy building in business, which is wanting to sort of make a mark as a creative person, to have your ideas and your way of doing things out in the world in a way that people can learn from it and appreciate it, even without you having to be like synchronously or physically present with them. That's another type of legacy building. So there's sort of like legacy building in terms of assets and inheritance. And then there's legacy building in terms of impact and contribution. And so I'm picking up that you're thinking about the latter type of legacy building. Does that feel correct?
Very much so. And you're making me realize that my dad owned a restaurant. I got to see someone have a physical business. He sold it, right? That has not entered my consciousness very much at all. I think it's more of like, am I going to have any regrets on my deathbed? Am I going to feel proud of what I did? And it's, yeah, very much that second.
The reason I wanted to point to those two types of legacy is because even if the former isn't on your mind, I think some of that's being lifted into how you might be going about the legacy building you're trying to do. So what I'm sort of seeing, and even just how you started to share, and we'll get back to social media in a minute, people, I promise, but there's this way of when we think about building a legacy, when we think about creating, products that can endure beyond us, then you've moved yourself into the digital product lane in your business. And I think you have very correctly uncovered and realized that that is a different business model than coaching. So a one-on-one coaching or service provider business is a totally different model than a digital products and courses business. And I would agree with you that when you're a coach, you may only need to meet a few dozen people a year to have enough of them become clients that you keep your coaching practice going in a way that's very like financially sustainable for a coach. When you're selling digital products, it's not the same thing. And when I see people make this move, which I have worked with so many coaches that want to build other revenue streams, one of the first things I like to do with people is start to figure out like, how big does this side of your business really need to be? Because if the real goal is legacy building, if that's what's at the heart of wanting to build this other side of your business, then literally doing anything will help you create that legacy. But I'm imagining from what you said that with the time scarcity and with being a parent, I think there's probably a lot of other things pouring into that where it's like, well, if I'm spending time on it, it should make money. If I'm putting energy into it, it should be bringing something back into the business or something like this. So I guess that's where I want to start, which is to start to peel back, like, what do you really want from this new arm of your business? What do you really want for the digital products and courses you're creating?
Yeah, great question. And I've done some self-inquiry. And if I'm honest with myself, I feel like the money part, I've never been, financial gain has never been my number one reason for doing anything in general or professionally. I think I've actually been more motivated by votes of confidence, which is another way of saying if someone buys a product for me or follows me, that is like, hey, you're interesting. And it's more of a tuning into a metric of like, am I resonating with people? And probably more of like a existential / ego centered, like, do I matter? And I think I'd been pretty content to, during the first 5 years of my business, just really settle into the ease of my one-on-one models. I'm always an experimenter. I always have I've done so many different group programs over the years, one for job seekers, one for personal finance, like really spanning a lot of different topics. But the one-on-one coaching is always stuck. And anytime my partner will just be like, hey, how was your day? I'll be like, great. I love my one-on-one clients. They're easy. And he's sometimes like, you always just have such a good time doing, why don't you just stick with that? Why doesn't leveling up with you mean just maybe finding clients that could, pay for different higher packages or something? But I think this current moment is also a product of just liking a good challenge and not wanting to get bored in my business. And so while I think that my clients are truly very interesting and I love coaching, it feels like if I don't have a side project going on that I'm not being myself. And I've never had my side project be product focused and all of the social media stuff that has come with it. So I think money definitely has something to do with it as just this obvious quantitative signal of worth. And I was talking to myself out loud before we hopped on, and I was hearing something that came out of my mouth, and I was like, oh, do I want to say that on the podcast? Which was, I felt like I wanted to have the products make enough money so that I could feel like a real contributor to my household. And I meant that financially. And I had to pause and be like, but I would be caring for our kids, if I'm working less, it just kind of highlighted the sort of the what we value in terms of being a breadwinner versus kind of caregiving. But I do think that pressure is there. So I think maybe what you might be hearing in my answer is it's a soupy mix of, yes, it's money as one signal. My main thing that makes me feel happy or sad is oh, did someone like this? And I think it kind of goes back to an old place of popularity contest is such an annoying way to say this, but just as a kid being oh, am I a cool kid? Am I not a cool kid? Right? I think there's some old kind of childhood wounding that is probably coming up here. And I'm so aware of that. And I've almost been telling myself, I need to vanquish this itch and just be done with it for all so that I can almost return back to the value set that I already know is my home.
Hearing you speak to that last piece, that definitely resonates with my experience of social media because so much of what I ended up doing there was working through my wounding around popularity and feeling like nobody was ever that interested in what I was doing or what I had to say. And also, it really forced me to work through a lot of my stuff around meritocracy, because when I went all in on social media, and I still didn't get Instagram famous, whatever that means. Like, I never, made it to 10,000 followers. I never even made it all the way past 3,000 followers. Like, when I put all of the time and energy and money that I could into it, and I still, quote unquote, failed at that, it really made me confront a lot of the things that I was like believing or telling myself at that point in time.
I'm glad I'm not alone.
Yeah, you're definitely not alone. And I think that's one of the big things on social media is that it's literally never enough. There is no number of followers that you could have that would be enough, because once you get to 10,000, then you're on the race to 100,000. Once you're on 100,000, you're on the race to 500,000. Once you're at 500,000, you're on the race to 1 million. Then you're on the race to multiple millions. And I personally had to leave social media to remove myself from that like context and that mindset, and to shift my sense of enoughness. Like, I couldn't find it when I was active on social media. So I'm so intrigued by your sort of like self-reflections, that you feel aware, or you sound aware, that there's something around this sort of like popularity wound that's coming up in your social media presence. It also seems like you're relatively aware that you go to these spaces for a sort of like validation and affirmation of both your work, and it seems a little bit of like your identity wrapped up in that work, and that like what you have to say is valuable and interesting to people. I think you use that word interesting. So that awareness, which I think can be really slippery on social media, right? If any amount of our self-worth that is wrapped up in there can be challenging or precarious, I think, for us based on the dynamics of the platforms. And then I'm with you in the soupiness of like, when I ask, like, what do you want for your business and this side of your business? It's like, well, I want to do the legacy building work, that there's something I can point to and say, I made that thing, not just, well, I had some conversations with these people in sessions that no one else can ever hear. Like, I hear you on the wanting that legacy, the permanent feeling of legacy building. And also that being mixed up in the sort of like, well, also, I do want it to make money. And also, there are these financial pressures. And also, there is this time sensitivity. And that is all coming in together.
Yes. I think another frame on this kind of future visioning exercise is looking to models of people. And so as I've been doing this as well, I've been looking to people who seem like they're quote unquote successful at selling digital products, at having hundreds of thousands of, followers or listeners or something. And I like have had to ask myself, from what I can gather from their life, is that what I want? And I think it's been really helpful, because the answer is, I don't think that their life seems like horrible by any means, but I think I have a really beautiful life already. And the people I look up to are not the ones who are selling the digital courses and posting on social media all the time. They might be still posting on social media, but they have very community relationship-based businesses. So like Tina Roth Eisenberg is one example of Creative Mornings, right? She's had a lot of impact, and you can see how she has chapters. If you don't know what Creative Mornings is, it's a kind of a free, inspiring creative breakfast lecture series that's been going on for years, and it's all over the world. And so like she's kind of this example of, there is a certain scale, but it's still the content of it is so relational.
Yeah, absolutely. I love looking to other people as a way of like possibility modeling. And also, I have to be very careful with my own like projections onto what I think is going on, or what I think is happening behind the scenes when I don't know anything about it. But I think it can be so helpful to look to friends or peers or people we admire and sort of see like, what type of business are they building? How is this working for them? And I do that with the acknowledgement that like, I never have any idea where the startup money for that came from, or how much they're actually paying themselves, if anything. And often the answer is nothing. So I think it's that both and of like, how can we surround ourselves with these sort of models of the types of lives we want to live and the businesses we want to build, while also being like really kind to ourselves and really careful around what we're projecting onto that. For me, what may have actually been even more helpful is looking to other people is like, I don't want that. Like, no, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you. So, that is honestly how, even what I shared at the very beginning of this conversation, like that's a lot of how I learned like, oh, I don't want a podcast like this. I don't want some giant podcast where I can never actually hear from listeners because there's so many that like, or like I have to hide my email address because there are too many people trying to reach out to me. Like, I don't want that. And I've heard those stories from people with giant podcasts. I don't want that. Or for me, like I've had a lot of entanglements this year around like traditional publishing. And I've had a traditional publishing deal in the past and I've walked away from that this year. And that was another one where I had to look to like, what is the reality of what this looks like when you have it? And I don't want that. And what does that mean for me? And how do I choose something different? So I love it on both sides, the sort of practice of like, this is a beautiful model I might want to build. And then this is actually something I'm really not interested. Glad that it played out for them so I can have that reflection for myself.
What comes to my mind is sometimes we have these models, but we don't know what it's going to be like for us. And there's so many details and behind the scenes things where it's like, I can gather or sense these things from these external people, but what if my version of it is different? And I think a related question I had prepped for you ahead of time was, I was listening to an episode of yours, I think it was around your 100th episode, kind of like commemorating that milestone. And you were doing a little bit of like a walk through memory lane of like this initial phase of starting the podcast and realizing like, oh, I'm not getting like, I'm getting like 100 downloads or something. And of course I related to that because like I'm right there right now. I'm loving creating my podcast. And it's a good amount of work. And a part of me has to kind of, again, reset expectations to say, okay, cool. If I got 75 people to listen to it, that's still really awesome. That's more than 0 if I hadn't recorded it. And so when you reflect back to what has actually changed since that kind of like moment of early starting out to the success that Off the Grid has had now, what comes to mind?
There have actually been like pretty major shifts. Like actually, I would say that Off the Grid is dramatically different and the landscape of it is dramatically different now than it was after that first season when I was getting about 100 downloads an episode. And I think that if I tried to just lay it out, it would look something like, Off the Grid used to just be the podcast and the Leaving Social Media Toolkit. Those pieces were there from the beginning. And they were always paired together in the episodes related to the toolkit. And I talked about the toolkit in all the episodes. But in season 1, that's all there was. And then I would sometimes send emails when the episodes went out. If you'd gotten the toolkit, you might get an email from me when there was a new episode. But that was it. It was very simple. It's very small. And now the landscape of Off the Grid, it's a whole ecosystem. I have the podcast, I have the toolkit. I send an email every single time there's a new episode. I never miss it anymore because now I have sponsors on the podcast and part of their ad packages, it's going to go to the email list. So now there's sponsors. I also have the interweb, which is the membership community around the show. As we're recording this, we have like over 170 members. So I'm really nearing that 200 member mark. I'm really starting to imagine what would the interweb look like if I designed it to be like my dream membership. Because when I started it, it was the thing I had time to do on top of running Softer Sounds. And now I'm really repositioning it as like, what if this was at the center of my business? And I also have the Clubhouse, which is the paid podcast that I host on Substack in addition to the public Off the Grid episodes. So it has grown so dramatically. And what's interesting is I think that there was definitely a part of me at the end of season 1 when there were only like 100 downloads per episode. I would have thought it would have to grow like 1,000 times or 100 times to get to this point where I could actually have a business that could sustain, my simple income from the podcast. But that hasn't been true. Like at this stage, most episodes get 1,700 to 2,000 downloads. And I've been able to build this business around that. So when I reflect back, what's really striking me right now is that there's been a lot of growth, but it wasn't as exponential as I may have guessed it would have to be to get to this point. And I think the reason it's worked is because I've always been so clear on what I want from it. I always wanted the podcast to lead to a sort of membership community. I wanted the membership model because I wanted recurring revenue that would be sustainable. I was really burnt out from selling courses and workshops and one-off stuff. And every time I've added something to the interweb, it has come from this like really deep place of like, this is what I need to keep making it. And it matches what people are asking me for. And I've had a million other ideas of things I could do. But if I don't have both of those pieces, I don't build it for Off the Grid.
I hear, and I can even just like mentally start to visualize this expanded ecosystem of like literally if you were to kind of plot out all the different touch points and how they connect, right? It's like more complex. And I guess my like follow-up questions are twofold. One is, well, what does that actually change for how you spend your time? And then what does that change in your body in terms of like how stressed you are or how confident you feel about something? Like what kind of like inner shifts has that expanded ecosystem created?
For me, I feel a lot of excitement. Like I love doing this. And so it feels thrilling to get to keep adding pieces and to keep working on it and to keep growing it. I noticed the opposite as Softer Sounds grew. Like the more clients I got and the more complex that business got, the less energy I had for it, the less excited I was to show up and work on other people's podcasts every day. But also that's been, I think, a really key part of this is like, it feels like a gift when I get to spend time on Off the Grid because it's my thing. And because over the past 3 years, I've spent so much time building other people's shows and being behind the scenes on other people's success, I think I'm really able to recognize what a gift and privilege it is to really turn my attention to my own work and projects and success. And that is very much shifting in 2025 and a little sooner than I expected. I really thought I was going to be more all in on Softer Sounds for this year, but just the way that the online business landscape is shifting, there's been a lot less podcast business and a lot more interest in Off the Grid as a show and a business. And so I've just been kind of letting things change. I get overwhelmed when there's too many things on my plate. So sometimes when I spin something up or when I have an idea, I make myself pause on it because it feels like it could be too much. But like when I launched Co-working Club through Off the Grid this year, that was like another thing. And some people were definitely confused. I got a couple emails that were like, wait, you have like, I'm doing all 4 of your things and I don't quite understand anymore. But I took that feedback, I added some clarity, and I kept going because I liked doing all of them. So I just let it be a little bit, a lot. I just let it be a lot. And that was okay for the spring. So yeah, that's kind of how it feels and how it as it's grown.
It sounds like you're finding a really nice balance between kind of knowing what the core or the heartbeat is of the business and still letting yourself experiment and add things on, but kind of not in like a hasty, impulsive way, like kind of pausing and sitting with it for a beat and then deciding like, yeah, I do want to do this, and kind of knowing that that is the privilege as being a self-employed business owner is like we get to create and spin up new things and then say it's over, right? You know, recently I did my own experiment. My head was telling me not to do it, but my intuition just overrode that and just said, do it. And it's actually coming to a close next month, again, on my own decision and in sense of like it was time to sunset it. So it was 7 months. It was called Launch Lab, and it was for self-employed creatives to find, you know, regular accountability. I would meet with people 3 times a week. We'd have Monday, Friday stand-up calls. And I loved it. I still really enjoy it. Maybe it kind of comes back around to this like what gives you energy / a popularity expectation topic, which is as members who'd been in it for 5 or 6 months, paying a monthly membership, were kind of like, I think I'm good, or I need to cut back on business expenses. I felt like there were more people leaving it than adding to it. And it still was like, wow, there's still, you know, say 30 people here instead of 50. But psychologically, and even a little bit financially, it was starting to get to the point where I'm like, whoa, I could have 4 coaching clients in exchange for navigating 30 different people and interactions. And I guess I was curious with the interweb and maybe even the clubhouse too for you. Like, have you ever had moments where you had to question that of like, is this people still wanting this? Are my numbers trending upward enough?
Oh yeah, I question that all the time. Not even just with the interweb, but with the podcast. I'm always looking to see like how numbers are trending across the season. Numbers are the highest at the start of any season because all the people that you've gathered during the break, get the first few episodes, and then life gets busy and people don't listen to every single episode of your podcast, even if you love it as much as I love mine. We're all human. People will regularly tell me, I love Off the Grid. I never miss an episode. Well, except for the past 3 weeks because I've been busy. I do that with my favorite shows. That's just how it works.
You've done this many times, so maybe you can have that confidence of generally these numbers throughout a season trend down. But right now, one thought is there's all these murmurings around online business changing. People are already overloaded with the news and what's going on politically, and talks about recession. Is that kind of changing what people have mental, energetic space for in terms of just putting a podcast in or purchasing something and kind of putting their money towards something? So sometimes I also feel vexed or confused about is it the fact that I'm trying to launch this course coinciding with people being pretty, clinging to their purse strings pretty tightly? And how do you sort of know a little bit of what the kind of general winds of the societal factors are, but not swirl or spiral?
Every single podcast episode this season, I feel like we have this acknowledgement that there's a lot happening in the world. There's a lot happening in the US. We're living through a really chaotic and violent time, and people have less bandwidth than ever. And so almost every business owner I know, things are trending down. They're making less money this year. They're selling less of whatever it is they sell. And some of us are finding ways to make up for that with other things. And some people just aren't and are having to work with less. And I think a lot about how much we just can't know. And how do you make a decision when you can't know all the factors? You can't know what's going to happen next. Do I stay the course, or do I quit this? Do I discontinue the program, or do I stick it out for a few more months? And that's where your intuition, like you said earlier, has to come into play. I think it's why it's so important as business owners and as creative people that we're tending to our intuition, that we are cultivating our spiritual practices, whatever that looks like for you. Going for a walk is a spiritual practice, going to church is a spiritual practice. I'm here for all of it, but tending to that part of ourselves is so important so that we can have an intuitive way of knowing when it's time to stop or start something. And yeah, I face this all the time in my business. I think there's so many things I've been trying to do that aren't working because of the state of the world. And I do think it's important as a business owner to have a little bit of a pulse on that, but that looks different for everybody. I like to think astrologically. So I have my moon and Venus in Gemini in the 6th house. I love to be on the internet. I love to think about work. I love that. I have dear, dear friends who are business owners with all their planets in Scorpio. It is very hard for them to look at the news, notice the high level chit chat happening. And what I try to remind all of us is one, I can do that noticing for a lot of people and share it and in a way that's curated and beautiful. I think if you're somebody who can't handle sort of being aware of the news without spiraling, you can find people who will curate things in a way you can take them in. And also, there's a lot of value in being that depth person. Maybe you don't know what's happening in the news, but you're still picking up on the current that people aren't feeling well, or you're picking up on those really deep, intuitive, subconscious, superconscious levels. So we all tap in our own ways, but I think it is really important to be tapped in, not just to what you're doing in your own way in your business, but how's your whole community around you? Because our businesses are about all of the people. You're selling to somebody, unless you have a patron, I guess, or an inheritance or a trust fund, and then you don't need to listen to a business podcast. But it is all relational, whether those relationships are happening in your email list, in your physical IRL life, or on social media. Hi there, Off the Grid listeners. Amelia here, interrupting today's episode because I want to tell you about a book. Now, this is not just any book. It is a business book, and it is the business book that has been my companion from my very first year in business to my first 5-figure month to the present moment where I'm thinking about how to scale back certain areas of my business so that I can grow others. That book is Free Time Lose the Busy Work, Love Your Business by Jenny Blake. In the book, Jenny charts her own journey from working a full-time job to starting a business that took over her life to developing the systems that allowed her to grow beyond her wildest dreams without getting burned out, bored, bottlenecked, or buried by bureaucracy in her business. Jenny's guiding question is, how can we earn twice as much in half the time with joy and ease while serving the highest good? And in the book, she teaches a 3-part framework that will help you align, design, and assign everything that needs to get done in your business based on your values, your energy, your strengths, and what you actually want from your work. Oliver Burkeman, author of the global bestseller 4,000 Weeks, says this about the book. Free time is a revelation, a detailed roadmap for building a business that fulfills you and serves the world, leaving anxiety and burnout behind. Jenny Blake's advice is grounded and inspiring and always connected to life as it is actually lived at the human scale. If you've ever hit a moment in your business where you just wanted to burn it all down, you are not alone, and this book can help. You can head to the show notes for the link to learn more, or just go to itsfreetime.com/book. That's itsfreetime.com/book. Thanks to Jenny for sponsoring this episode, and thanks to you for listening. I truly hope you'll go pick up a copy of Free Time so that you and I can chit-chat about it in the future. For now, let's get back to this episode.
What if I could frame it that my efforts and presence on social media are not because of social validation? I'm trying to kind of like get signal for my business, not for me as a person. And I know they can be conflated at times. Have you ever yourself or talked to anyone that feels like an example that comes to mind of someone who's been able to separate out the personal side and have it truly be like a signal out for their business? Because I've never been someone who's gotten sucked into social media. I'm never someone who's like consuming and at risk of scrolling. I don't waste or spend any time on that. I also am not like a refresher person. I kind of post it and maybe I'm a kind of avoidant. And so part of me feels like it's not as dangerous to me because my own practices and relationship to social media it does not suck me in. So could I just conceive of it as like, these are my advertising dollars for my business, and I don't need to like fear that it's gonna take over my social self.
Yeah, I like how you're putting this together, and I have some questions. So typically when I talk to people, with sort of the original question you've brought me of like how to navigate this choice point of like stay or go. Do I stay on social media or do I leave social media? Normally what I like to anchor in is like, how does it feel? And is it working? And I think that for a lot of people I speak to, and this voice has been on the podcast many times and coming out of many people's mouths, it's sort of like, it feels awful. I get so hooked. I'm so stressed. I have all of these like sort of comparison moments. Like it feels really bad. And when that's the case, we just have to do a lot of like, first of all, permissioning that it's okay to leave. Like it's important. If you are feeling bad, you can make a decision to quit that thing so you stop feeling bad. Like I help a lot of people just like cultivate the permission to do that. And with that, the strategy of like, okay, well, how are we going to keep your business going without it? So like it needs both. But what I'm hearing you say is like, that's not the case for you. It doesn't feel awful. Then it goes to my other question. So we asked, how does it feel? We've kind of talked through that, but like, is it working? And this is my big question for you. Like, what do you want from being on social media? Like, if it was going super well, what would that look like? And then like, do you think it's working for you, or do you think you're getting toward that thing?
One thing I'd add to the how does it feel question, which is spot on, is it doesn't feel bad, but I do get a small dopamine hit when I like refresh my little thing. And because I've had so many years of not trying at all, and now I'm like, okay, cool, I'm investing this money in these ads. And every time I get like 10 new followers, like for me, because I have so few, it's like, oh, cool, that's great. But it doesn't like, it's just so quick in passing, like any kind of dopamine hit. I think the thing that feels actually not horrible, but not great is how much time it takes to create content and piece that together. And again, I feel like I optimized early in my business where the grand majority of my time was spent coaching and doing the thing that I feel like I'm meant to do. Not only that, right? I want to give myself room for other things. I don't think I'm not grandly opposed to being on camera. And again, I just don't feel like I have that sort of like cringe or fear of being directly speaking to the camera, but it's not like energizing. So, last 2 nights ago, I was up till 9:30 editing my podcast and making the social cuts of it. And like, I just felt so drained. And as someone who's like never been at risk of overworking in my life, I think I've tend toward balance. This has been the most where I'm like, oh, I can see how if I keep at this rate, I could hit what people everywhere are calling burnout, right? So that part isn't feeling good. And then I think to answer your question around what do I want? Yeah, like I've had several close friends ask me this, and it's like it's a humbling question or a stumper of a question because it's like, okay, cool, let me play this out. So I get more and more followers. Maybe that leads to some sales of my course or more inbound for my coaching. The next level up is like, okay, I could get a sponsor for my podcast. I could actually think of the money I'm spending in a podcast editor and, the podcast itself like would feel like a little bit more of an income generator. And then I think beyond that, and probably the most like tantalizing is like, what if I had something so compelling or unique to say or to offer that people wanted me to speak and I could go fly and give a talk that someone would even consider me for, TED Talk, even a Creative Mornings talk, right? Like, so part of it is with enough social proof that you have something valuable, then you can get invited to events with even more visibility. And then I go back to, well, then how would that make me feel? Probably cool, like to get those opportunities. Would that like kind of that idea of financially, right? You hit like a certain level of affluence, and then how much does actual more money truly like up your everyday happiness? My guess is probably not a ton. But I think I'm also someone who loves variety. I love experiences, and I love the idea of like access to different kinds of social gatherings. And so I think that's another thing that would come from it if I really play this out.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I really appreciate you doing that because I think there's so many listeners who that's exactly what's happening in their head on social media. And like we're not like playing it out. We're not putting it all into words. We're not saying it, but it's like, okay, I'm trying to grow my social media presence because I want sponsors for my podcast. I want speaking opportunities and I want more students in my course and more clients for my coaching. And the thing I would say to that is that you can have all of those things without social media. And I don't say that to be flippant, but because I have seen it be true, right? There are so many people I know who have done creative mornings talks who have very small or no social media presence. There are so many people I know who have podcast sponsors or who have elevated their shows in all sorts of ways without social media. Even the people I know who run podcast PR agencies, social media is not a big part of their strategy anymore because it's not the best place to grow shows. So I think that's like an interesting place to kind of interject there. And then also like more students for courses and more clients for coaching. It's interesting to hear you talk about like digital products because courses, especially like live cohort courses, can really fall in this sort of in between that sort of like digital product or service-based business. And I think that there are digital products that are much more like self-guided, low touch, low cost that do require that big audience, but courses don't necessarily. And it sounds like you've spun up many successful courses or ongoing small group containers without a large social media presence. So I think for me, what comes up is social media is not necessary for any of those things. I think for some people, it has been a shortcut to some of the things that you're craving or you're wanting. But I also think that sort of era of social media being a shortcut is rather over. Like now, if you want to get those things in this way, it requires a lot of work and it requires buying ads and the things that you're talking about. So I'm curious how hearing me say that makes you feel wanting to affirm everything you've shared and also kind of provide my perspective of like, you don't have to do this to get that.
I appreciate the check-in. It makes me feel maybe two main things. One is relief of like, yes, great. Thanks for just confirming what I hoped was already true. And I think your most recent episode that I listened to, you were talking about like, oh, this kind of controversial new idea that the age of social media is like kind of like coming to an end. And that feels relevant here of like being an exciting idea. Like, well, you don't really need this anymore. This is actually not the way. And in some ways, I kind of feel like I'm late. I'm really late to the party. I'm a late adopter, right? So there's relief. And then I think there's also curiosity of like, but then how, like when I think about some of the people who've been on my podcast, I realize like many of them have written books. And again, that's kind of this idea of like, did you have enough to say where you could kind of coalesce enough around a book? And from those handful of interviews, I've just heard like to get published in a traditional publishing way, they're looking for the following. They're looking for social proof that there's going to be enough people who are interested to buy this thing. Many people are going the self-publishing route, and you can do it that way. Then makes me think, creative mornings in Portland, I've been to many of them. When I looked back at the guest list or the speakers, so many of them actually had physical spaces. And I thought that was really interesting of like there's something kind of like impressive still about creativity that's anchored to a physical space. And that could be in my future when I don't have a little toddler to chase around. But I would ask you if you're open to sharing, like, it's easy to gloss over, like, okay, I was at that 100 downloads, now I'm at 2,000 downloads or something. And that change actually came with a lot of different opportunity and your evolved ecosystem. How do you explain the like maybe bigger jumps of growth?
As I have been doing, I want to respond to the things you said, and then I will tell all of my secrets, which are not secrets.
Yeah, and forgive me if you've already shared some of this in a previous episode.
No, I love this. I like you've tapped into a lot of things I think listeners wonder about, so it's great. I'm an open book. It just doesn't always occur to me what page to open the book to for everybody. So what I wanted to say in response to what you shared is that everything I said about like all of this stuff is possible without growing a large social media presence first. All of that is true. And there are definitely gatekeepers and industries that are going to like throw up stop signs in front of you the whole way if you don't have a social media presence. And publishing is still the big one. This is going to come out a lot more in the upcoming season I'm going to do around publishing a book without social media, because that's been my journey with social media. Is like I was one of the very lucky people who got a book deal with a small social media following. But when I tried to sort of like re-engage the traditional publishing space for my upcoming book, because I was not on social media, it just like, it wasn't a no from them, but it was like a super like skeptical, like, well, we're not going to invest any more than we did before. Like, even though my audience has grown so much, it's so much bigger than it was when I put out my first book. That doesn't matter to them because there's no sort of like social media presence that they can point to. And so I want to be clear that like there are trade-offs and there are doors that will be closed to you if you don't have a large social media following. But that is a conversation you and I would be having if you had like 600,000 Instagram followers instead of like 600 Instagram followers, right? Like those doors aren't open to you anyway. And you would have to grow so much for your social media following to impress a traditional publisher. And also writing a book wasn't even on your list of things you wanted to do. So I play all that out because there are so many people I know who like have this sort of question of like, should I stay or should I go on social media? And they listen to me talk and they're like, but Amelia, one day I might want to write a book and I'll need the thing. And I'm like, hold up. Do you want to write the book? Is that like actually legitimately like in your core the goal? And if you do want to write the book, is the goal around the book like it's got to have a traditional publisher behind it? And then why? Like I always just like to dig in so much because there's so many places that questions can arise when we try to make a decision about social media. And I think it's important to really like slow it all down and get back in our bodies and like discern what we really want. And if social media is necessary for the path there, and then even then we can ask more questions. But that was just coming up for me first before I dive into like my growth.
I think I just want to reflect back, like a takeaway already from our conversation is your capacity and practice of asking the like, so then what? And then what would happen? And like playing it out, or so why, right? Like get down to the root and then kind of be like, cool, if we know the original need that you're trying to meet, let's look at the expanse of different pathways to get there. So I think it's really smart. And anyone who's listening could probably just take out a pen and paper and ask themselves the same thing.
And the reason we have to do this is because social media has billed itself as the answer to all of our questions. Oh, you want to make more friends? Get on social media. Oh, you want to sell your toaster? Get on social media. Oh, you want to start a business? Get on social media. Like the role that social media has taken in our society is now so vast that it's become the answer to so many of our problems that it is more necessary than ever that we really like start to ask ourselves, like, wait, why? Why am I doing this on social media? Does social media actually solve that problem that I have? Is this a place that I want to go for this? Like, I just like to unpack those questions because it's so, frankly, like so quickly, social media is a relatively new invention. It has so quickly become so pervasive. And again, it's just like, how does it feel? And is it working? And for most people, it's not feeling great and it's not working. And this reminds me of one other thing I wanted to respond to that you said earlier before I talk about those growth points in the off the grid journey. You mentioned earlier that, you've never really felt drawn to social media and you're kind of like being like face to camera, all of that. Like you're doing it and it's fine, but it doesn't like light you up or doesn't feel like exciting. And I cannot tell your future, but from what I have seen on and off of social media, if you don't love it, it's not going to work. Like it will work a little bit, but it will not ultimately take us all that far if we are not in love with what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I was somebody who did love it. I loved talking into my phone. I loved doing Instagram lives. Like, I like being a content creator. It is a really fun lane for me. And I still couldn't make it work. And so I think that if it doesn't feel good at any point in the journey, if it always just feels kind of like, okay, I can do this, maybe any of us just haven't found like quite our lane or quite our outlet. Like podcasting for me feels so good. I've said this on the show before. Like I literally get so excited when I'm recording by myself or editing. I have to like shake it out of my body. I am vibrating with how excited I get. And I used to feel that way about writing. I would get so in flow that I'd be fully immersed. And I think that we have to find those things. And I'm sure there are people listening being like, Amelia, I will never feel that way about a marketing activity. But I think we can. We just have to find the right ones for us. Maybe it is working one-on-one with people or having a one-on-one conversation. Maybe it's podcasting. Maybe it's hosting free events. There are so many things we can do. Like, what are the ones that feel really exciting to us? I just find that always brings the most resonance.
I think I did that kind of self-inquiry work too of like what lights me up, and it's being live in conversation with people, which is why the podcast felt like such the obvious medium. Also just the length of time and the depth that you can go with like an hour interview. And then again, the little tendrils, the little offshoots of that to direct attention back to the podcast were the little snippets, were the social kind of Instagram, YouTube that just like is meant to sort of fuel and feed the podcast as that heart. So maybe in some ways I'm kind of leading back to that question of like, so then how did you do that and grow the podcast without those little offshoots?
Okay. If like the podcast is what you love, if like the one-on-one conversation is what you love, there's so many ways you can get creative with that. What if you live streamed every podcast interview on YouTube? So there's this like live version people can come to and go to, and you get that energy of other people in the room since you have such an event background. Especially if you're using a tool like Riverside, you can actually live stream anything now. So you could live stream the recording and then have an edited version that goes on the podcast feed. That could be a way to galvanize more people around different stages of the podcast process. I also always tell people that if your goal is to grow your audience, being a guest on other people's podcasts is going to have that effect more quickly than having your own show. Because on your own show, you're just talking to the one person and then you have to bring the audience to it. On other people's shows, you're in front of an audience they've already gathered, and then you can hopefully bring that audience back to your podcast audience. Also, maybe instead of doing paid ads on social media, you're placing ads on other podcasts that are related. And that is a way of like getting in front of people who are already podcast listeners. They're much more likely to come listen to your show as a podcast listener than somebody who's on social media is going to become a podcast listener just to hear your show. So those are just some ideas that I say like enthusiastically because I love this sort of problem of like, okay, I figured out what I like, but I can't get that to work. And I'm like, oh, there's so much we can do. I've had podcast clients who host a podcast party in wherever they live, like at the end of a season or the start of a new season. They invite their guests, they invite their community, they do raffles, they do giveaways to fund production of the next season. I've like seen people do such creative and interesting things. All of that can support a podcast.
And I love those ideas, and the little fear voice comes in and is like, well, cool. Like that's going to work if you have surpassed a certain level of legitimacy. Like with the live stream, my first thought was, oh, what if people can just see that there's 5 people tuning in? Is that going to look lame? With the podcast ad swap is like, well, if someone's looking for my numbers and they're not that strong right now, are they going to even want to do that? So I guess I'm kind of illuminating some of the little fear voice that pops up and is like, but what if it doesn't work? And here's all these reasons why.
100%. And yeah, probably the first time you do a live stream, there will be 5 people there because you're doing something nobody does, right? But like when you do something interesting, like it can take a while to get any uptake, but it's novel and it's cool. And if you did that, then probably I would talk about it on Off the Grid because I'm like, oh, that's so interesting. I've never seen anybody do that before. And then I talk about it and that brings people in and then those people tell someone. And then in a few months, you have 50 people there and then it can continue to grow. Or maybe it never gets bigger than 50, but you do book 3 clients because those people saw your innovation and your interest. And, I think that is like, that's how I play that out. And I love that you brought this up because that fear is so real. And the things I always want to say to it are like, it has to be an experiment. We have to bring an experimental mindset to these things so that we reframe failure as more information and we can embrace it in those ways. And also, we have to celebrate the tiniest wins. Like the first win for that example is like, oh my gosh, I figured out how to live stream. I did it. It went okay. Maybe it's a gift if no one comes to the first one because you're like, oh, didn't know what I was doing. That was funny. And then the second one, there's 5 people. Like we have to celebrate every person. And something that I learned from, I think it was from my friend Emily way back in the day, but I think she learned it from somebody else, was like she was selling a group program and it was a relatively small group, but I think she wanted a few dozen people. And every time somebody bought it, she wrote their name on a note card and taped it to her wall. And so she really like visibly brought those people into her space with her. And 5 note cards is amazing. But 5 just like emails that you tucked away in a folder feels less exciting. So I think like we have these ways of remembering it's an experiment and then really celebrating and uplifting those successes because it's so easy to discount 5 people, but we like have to celebrate them instead. And also, I'm not naive. I don't think you're going to like make a podcast for 5 years if you only ever have 5 people listening. So like I understand wanting more growth, but I think that's where I work with my like expectation setting and I work with my intention and specificity because it's so easy. It would be so easy for me to be sitting here right now saying like, well, my podcast only has 2,000 downloads per episode and that's really not enough. And like it really needs at least 10,000 downloads so I could like book an ad company that would put sponsors on. So I really get like, it's so easy to get in that place of nothing is ever enough. And for me, my metrics for podcast success actually have nothing to do with download numbers, so I don't really know why I talk about them. What I actually care about is how many interweb members are there? How many Clubhouse members are there? How much revenue is the show generating? Because I don't need a podcast to get bigger into infinity. I want a business that sustains me. And so I have to keep my eye on the right place so that I'm actually in touch with what really matters to me specifically.
Mm-hmm. I guess of your list of ideas, I'm hearing maybe that you haven't done the live streams of your podcast, but
No.
like, did you find that being a guest on someone else's podcast? I think I saw on your website that there's like select press, and did you notice a notable bump from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So now I can actually answer your question from many moments ago around like what were the growth points in my show. The growth points in my show noticeably have been when some person with a much bigger audience than me has co-signed me in some really meaningful way or has uplifted me in some really meaningful way. So I think I can actually probably name 3 or 4 points where this has happened. The first jump is when I was a guest on the 12th House with Michelle Pelizan-Lipsitz of Holisticism. The next jump was when Cody Cook-Parrott shared episodes of Off the Grid in their newsletter many weeks in a row, and a ton of their followers came my way. I also think I got pretty significant jumps when Nick Antoinette did the same thing after being a guest on the show and shared her episodes multiple times with her community. And then the biggest jump was probably when I was a guest on We Can Do Hard Things with Glennon Doyle, Abby Wambach, and Amanda Doyle, which was in December of 2024. Each of those are people who had much bigger platforms than me and shared either my voice being a guest on their show or their episode of my podcast or another episode of the show they loved with their community. And the way that every single one of those opportunities happened was through relationships. I did not pitch those people. I did not request spots on those shows. I did not request those promo boosts. What happened was I knew Michelle from Holisticism because I was a member of her community, a paying member of the community for quite a while. And then when the show needed a new podcast editor, they knew I had a podcast studio from what I had been posting and sharing in the community. They hired me to be the editor. That eventually got my podcast on their radar, and they invited me on the show to talk about being off social media. With Cody heard my interview on the 12th House and then started listening to Off the Grid, loved the episodes, and then started sharing them in their newsletter. And I believe that's how Nicole found out about the podcast, but I would have to clarify exactly. But Nicole was then a guest on the show when she left social media, and we had a really amazing conversation. She was a longtime podcast host who didn't have an active podcast at the time. So her community was so rabid for more podcasts to listen to. And then the way I got on We Can Do Hard Things is that 5 or 7 years ago, I replied to an email on a listserv, and I did a blog interview for somebody who ended up running a podcast PR agency. That person got to know Lauren LaGrasso, who's the producer of We Can Do Hard Things. And when I later hired the podcast PR company to do some pitching for me, they pitched me to Lauren for her podcast. We had a great conversation. And when Glennon wanted to do a social media episode of We Can Do Hard Things, Lauren rode really hard for me to be the person she talked to about it. And that's how I ended up on the show. So all of it was sort of like gateways to larger audiences, and all of it came from relationships. And that is like what I hang my hat on, I suppose.
I know. I feel like just making a dramatic action right now. Just close the laptop. Okay, I'm turning off the meta ads. I'm reaching out. I'm kind of going back to my little digital Rolodex. And I mean, I found some similar things, not that in this particular domain, but it's so cool to hear you reflect back and see that consistency of it was all through relationships. The fact that you weren't always the one pitching yourself doesn't mean that there wasn't effort to maintain those relationships or be in the room or be thought of, right? But yeah, I'm such a fan of reaching out, and you never know what's going to happen. And, just small things. Like a client of mine told me about a course that helps freelancers with business and kind of contracting side of being a designer freelancer. And I messaged the people who run the course, and I asked about if I could take the course for free, which I felt was kind of a bold ask. And I said, because I want to be able to recommend it to other clients that could use it. And I ended up being one of their first affiliates for it. And essentially, all of their designers, and they have a pretty active Slack community, I get new business from that sometimes where they're like, oh, I saw you on the resource list from the Chutzpah course. So I don't know, if you do that times 100, that network effect, that compounding effect, I'm sure will help. And I think our conversation today has been really just such a powerful reminder of it is okay to experiment and try things out. But for me, I need to maybe kind of sit with this and take stock of well, how long am I going to try this out? And maybe taking your questions from today, what is it really for? How many sales do I really want to get? Is it really about that? And what are the other routes there? I would love to spend the same 10 hours of social media posting creation that I might spend in a month and put that towards researching and outreach. So yeah, you might have just changed the history of my business.
Well, it's an honor and a privilege. And, I love what's coming up here as well, which is that it's not binary thinking. It's not either or, right? Just because we had this conversation doesn't mean you have to go delete your Instagram immediately. In fact, that's not what I'm recommending. But even the question of what if you just dropped your social media posting time down to 2 hours a week and spent those other hours on activities that you felt were more directly aligned to the goals that you have. So what if you spent 2 hours a week, actually reaching out to people who have done Creative Mornings Portland and asking if you could meet up with them. Like if they've been the speakers, I bet that would lead to a Creative Mornings speaking spot way faster than trying to grow a social media platform that might get their attention, right? So it's not that you can't do both. And you have built this practice now of posting on social media. So it may feel really natural some days to just like pop into stories and do something. But it's such a different energy when that's just like, okay, this feels like the right place to share this thing than like, okay, this is the one place I'm marketing my business. Like we can do a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be like I'm on social media or I'm off social media. What I recommend is just that social media never be the only thing anyone's doing.
Yes, I like that reframe of, okay, if I ask myself, do I have something I feel excited to share that I want to put out there, then great, versus the should, right? Okay, I should post because my little schedule that I made for myself says that I should. I would actually point to another origin of my interest in like dialing up my marketing efforts and social media presence because I started listening to a particular podcast. A friend told me about a podcast that is all about marketing, and it's not totally Instagram focused. It's like how to grow your email list. But I found myself listening to those episodes kind of like in the way that I might watch the occasional reality TV show. I'm like, oh, I don't think this is making me necessarily a better person. It's not totally values aligned. And yet I keep kind of coming back to it because it's agitating some part of lack, some part of like, oh, I'm not doing enough. And that's has a strange, like addictive quality in and of itself. And so as I was recognizing that if every single, week I have 2 podcasts from this person, I need to like put some different things between my ears. And that's when I asked my community, which podcasts are you listening to? I think that's how I found out about Off the Grid in the first place. And they said, hey, maybe you should check this one out. And it was just so nice to have like through the same vehicle, through the same portal in my little earbuds, have just as valid of a voice saying, hey, here's a different way you can do it. Right. So it is really powerful to be a content creator and to kind of keep spreading ideas and modeling different ways of doing that. And that's such a gift that you're giving to people with this show. So I'm really honored to be invited on. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that beautiful reflection. And I can also relate to it. Like when I started my business, I listened to so many marketing podcasts. I mean, who among us has not been led down the Pinterest path by Jenna Kutcher or led down the launch path by Marie Forleo? Like, and that's not to like critique it, whatever. Like everyone's on their own path, but I'm with you. Like I too can get sucked into those easy answers. And I think that time and time again, what I'm doing on Off the Grid is to some people very dissatisfying because I try not to give anybody the answer. I don't have the answers. There is no answer to give. Like business is a practice that we all have to undertake over and over again. And I can offer sort of mindsets around it's all an experiment and we need to get to know what works for us so we can work in alignment with that rather than against that and all these things.
You know what you've modeled today is that question asking. And I think that really does feel true to the ethos of coaching, which is like, we don't know the answer for our clients. We are there to sort of like reflect things back, to inquire, to help them kind of figure out their own truths. And we can kind of like present ideas or like loving nudges from time to time. And I think that's what you've done. And if you let people kind of make their own choices from there and not be so pedantic of like, this is what you should do, then you're setting yourself up to play a different role than sort of the teacher / like guru.
Melissa, I also feel like you have modeled this beautifully. You asked me so many thoughtful questions today. I'm so grateful for this time we got to have together. Like also, listeners, I just need you to know this is like the first time Melissa and I have ever had like a conversation that wasn't just maybe like logistic or email. So this feels so special to me. And I'm sure there must be listeners who are like, oh, I want to have conversations like this. And while maybe they can't do that with me all the time, they can do it with you. So will you tell people how they can stay in touch with you or get to know your work better?
Yes, my website is coherence.studio. And I've popped up a special page for Off the Grid listeners. So if you go to coherence.studio /off the grid, you can find a little gift bag, a goodie bag, grab bag, whatever you want to call it, of just kind of curated resources that might specifically appeal to you if you're listening to this show. And yeah, I don't know at the time this show airs if I'll be on Instagram. Maybe you'll look for Coherent Studio on Instagram and it'll be gone. I don't know. But at the current moment of recording, that also does exist. So you can kind of check out my strivings there.
We love it and cheer you on in all of the ways and places you show up. Well, thank you again, Melissa, for joining me in this conversation. Thank you, listeners, for spending all of this time with us in this long form Off the Grid episode. And until next time, we will see you off the grid. Thanks for listening to Off the Grid. Don't forget to grab your free Leaving Social Media toolkit at offthegrid.fun/toolkit. This podcast is a Softer Sounds production. Our music is by Melissa Caitlin Carter of Making Audio Magic, and our logo is by Natelier Studio. I'm your host, Amelia Ruby, and until next time, I'll see you off the grid and on the interweb.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go off the grid. Okay. I know that you really want to